I'm Richard Marshall, and I wanted to record my feelings about being an older parkour practitioner and express how you can measure my activity and how that could potentially help coaches and other practitioners. And the result is this presentation that I delivered recently at Coach Europe in Valencia. Except this version has had the exercises changed a little to suit the needs of video. So, who am I and how did I get here? So, when I was a little child, at what we call junior school here, my school report said, doesn't know what's happening but seems to enjoy running around, which is kind of sums up my approach to any sporting activity. As I got older, I realized that I really hated team sports and the constant fixation on winning. And especially more, it wasn't just winning, it was about defeating the other people. Winning wasn't sufficient. And that really put me off any kind of activity. Then when I was at university and I was trying to play squash with a friend, I realized that the notion of rules was really putting me off. And in particular in squash, I was enjoying rallies and I didn't really understand the point of trying to play so that the other person would miss the ball. That just seemed like a completely stupid idea. Anyway, I did a lot of work in theatres, doing lighting, which involved climbing ladders and going through small crawl spaces, and really, really loved doing that. And that was another aspect that I really enjoyed, the movement and the physicality of all that. But again, there's no rules, and it's something that you do as a group of people working together, but it's not the same as a team, but there's this collective sense of activity. I was lucky enough to be given a job in the south of France, in Provence, and I was living at the Mont Sainte-Victoire, and I learned there to do rock climbing, and I was lucky enough to work with a group of people who were professional rock climbers and very talented climbers who weren't necessarily professionals, but it was a great experience because I discovered what's now called lifestyle sports and discovered that people could do something because it was about self-improvement and the collaborative and supportive environment, somewhat similar to parkour. Same thing, I was moved to Paris and I went bouldering in Fontainebleau, which was an interesting experience. Again, supportive, interesting environment, big challenges, and people working on things together. After that, I ended up becoming an entrepreneur, and that's very time consuming, life consuming, and I got fat and tired and unfit. So I was then introduced to a wonderful man called Ian McAlden, who is a former soccer goalkeeper and who is now mainly training female soccer players. And anyway, he was a fantastic PT that took me through from hating the idea of doing exercise through to loving it, which was very important. Then I got a job with an amazing company that involved a lot of travel and great meals and staying in nice hotels, and I got fat again and didn't have much time for exercise because I was moving around and was very busy. So anyway, I left that after a while and started my own business again and became a parkour person in 2018 and really have been training as many times a week as possible when not traveling, and even when I'm traveling I try and get some parkour in. And interestingly, when I was beginning, I was in the gym at Access Parkour for the Room to Move, and I used to drive down and I realized that was silly and I moved back to cycling. And all of this has really resulted in a big improvement in fitness levels. Not quite as fat as I was, not as thin as I'd like, but then that's probably true for everybody. So it's an interesting situation that has moved me into something that I had not expected or looked for, which was that if I go to a parkour event, people say to me, "Oh, I know who you are. I follow you on Instagram," which is really nice. And I've even had videos that have had, and this particular one, 221,000 views, although most of them are in the few hundreds or low thousands. And people say I'm an inspiration, which is really gratifying. It's not something I was looking for. And very few people come up to me or send me messages online saying I'm too old. Doesn't happen very much, unfortunately. That's something that does seem to affect female older practitioners, which is completely unacceptable. I'm also very proud to have been involved in things like the Scotchy Gang posts, where I am surrounded by amazing athletes, and it's just not something I was looking for, but it's really gratifying. And I'm also an elected director on the national governing body for Parkour in the UK, Parkour UK. So, what does Parkour mean for me? Well, it's an entertainment, it's relaxation, it's distraction. It's a time which I can shrug off my responsibilities for my work. It's a time for play. It's a time for freedom, but in a collaborative environment, and sharing the excitement and encouragement of success. It's a break from sitting at a computer. It's a chance to get hands-on with concrete and steel bars. And it's time to get dirty. And all of that leads to feeling good. It's about celebrating small wins and that self-improvement that is really the thing that I think we should all be looking for. It's certainly something that I find tremendously exciting. For me, parkour is not work. I don't intend to make money out of it. I'm not interested in being a coach. I always just want to be a practitioner for my own entertainment. I'm not interested in competing. For me, that's not the point. I'm definitely not interested in being disappointed. I want to have that sense of small successes, small wins, collaborative activity. And it's also, apologies to the ADD people out there, it is not for me something about a constant grind of hours of QMing followed by some jumps or whatever. I don't have the time or the energy. It's about, for me, being out there enjoying doing new stuff, and it's not about repetitive conditioning. It's occasionally useful, but not systematically. So, as a first exercise, you might want to consider pausing the video and thinking about what is parkour for you and what is parkour not for you. I use the word parkour throughout to include free running, ADD, jumping about, motion, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to use the word parkour because I like the sound of it. So let's jump in to fun. This is a picture of me doing an underbar over a box at Room to Move a few years ago, which was a big breakthrough for me because I thought I wasn't going to be able to do it, and then I was doing it and I was hugely happy at this achievement. It's a small achievement, but nonetheless it's very gratifying. So where does that fit into a scale of activity? So how do we measure this? So I came up with this idea of a training litmus paper. Now, litmus paper is something you use in chemistry to determine whether a fluid is acid or alkali. There's some translations of a litmus paper at the bottom of the page. If you're not familiar with the English, or the concept is that you put it into the fluid and it changes color. That's what you need to know. So the scale goes easy, comfortable, stretch, and impossible. So any particular move that I do, where does it fit? Is it reassuring? Is it good for warm-up? Does it confirm that I can still move? Then it's an easy thing. If it's comfortable, it further builds up my confidence. It warms up muscles. It warms up my mental ability as well. It makes me realize that I can do more. It's encouraging. And then that moves me into the stretch zone where my mind is challenged and my body is pushed. And then finally, there's another zone beyond stretch, which is way beyond my current comfort zone. It's too physically demanding or it's too scary. So this is something that if I look at an exercise, a move, a jump, whatever it happens to be, I think, where does it fall on this spectrum from easy through to impossible? I'm going to use this throughout the beginning of this section. And it's interesting to look at other ways of assessing it. So the easy and comfortable are things that I know I can do. They're things that are reassuring and build up that mental capacity as well as warming up the physical capacity. But it's important because it builds a bridge into believing that you can do more. Everybody obviously gets better with training and then they can move to the right. So stretch is the things I believe I can do. But then as we move into impossible, there is a category in impossible that is, I can't do it yet. Today I would fail and hurt myself. And then there's another category of things that are beyond my capability forever. I'm never going to be able to do the manpower jump, for example. And it's really, really important to accept that there are some things that you can't do. You shouldn't aspire to things that are literally beyond your capability. But you can always push forwards into areas which fall into that. I will be able to do it. And Of course, we're all familiar with the annoying thing that I could do last week, but I can't do today, that it typically fits between comfortable and stretch. So it's something that is, for whatever reason, out of your capability today, but you could do it last week and you can probably do it next week. Now, there's an important point in this scale, which is up towards the end of stretch. Good training is something that gets you to there. It's deeply satisfying. You feel you've made progress. You've come out your comfort zone. You're in your stretch zone and you're proceeding towards impossible. You've really made progress. That's exactly what you want. Unfortunately, if the training program starts at that point, it's totally frustrating because you can't do it and it just puts people off. So it's really important to consider where you fit the training for any particular trainee. If you're a coach in this plan, or if you're developing your own activity, you need to understand where it fits. And this is important because as a coach, you're doing this all day, every day, and you have a different set of easy, comfort, and stretch positions. And I call this a capability skew. And the fact that this could be applied to me, because it just doesn't fit my model, is something that undoes the magic. It makes it disappointing and very frustrating. So when you are looking at this, it's really important to make sure that you're addressing the scale for the trainee, not for the coach. What else can we use the litmus for? We can look at actual physical capability, which is all the way from easy up to somewhere in impossible. And then we can also look at the fun zone. So the fun zone is the stuff that is not completely trivial, that you can do without any action whatsoever, up to the end of stretch. Then there's a challenge zone, which takes you from stretch up into the beginning of impossible. And working in the challenge zone, once you're warmed up, is where you will end up improving yourself and reaching targets. We can take these same blocks and say, how does our actual physical capability map onto our estimated capability? And people of my age typically are underestimating their capability. They don't realize how much they can actually do. I always hear people saying, oh, I'm not strong enough to do that, or I couldn't jump there. And it's sad because they could. On the other hand, typical thing of teenage boys is that they overestimate their capability. And this creates a danger zone where people will hurt themselves, where they think they can do something that they can't, and they will attempt to do a bigger jump than they're able to, or flips, or whatever it happens to be. This is a really dangerous place for them to be. And this leads me on to asking a slightly unusual question. So what matters to you? Is it winning or not losing? I mentioned this a little bit earlier about the team sports. For me, it's about not losing. I don't want to lose an activity. Loss aversion is very important for me, and it's a very powerful activity, and people tend to fall into one or other of these camps. And the people who want to win at all costs tend to want to be more competitive. They want to have teams and win, etc., obviously, whereas the people on the left are people who don't want to try something necessarily, because if they're not good at it, they're going to fail. They don't like failing because failing is a loss. Therefore, it's really important to help people through this transition and recognize that all the small progresses they're making are not losing. And the other thing you can use loss aversion for is ensuring regular attendance. So people who don't turn up for class regularly, they are losing out, and it's important to use that as an encouragement for regular participation. Now, another moment to pause if you choose to. How do you judge where either yourself or your students are on the training litmus? How would you do that? And also reflect on what matters to you. Is it not losing or is it winning? And how does that affect your practice? Now let's move on to fear. This is me standing at the Vennel in Edinburgh. I have a lamppost behind me which I've used to get standing up because I'm terrified of standing on rails. This is one of my big fear factors. Now, an important aspect of the Vennel, this location, is that Mary's Milk Bar, the best ice cream in the world, is sold down at the bottom of it. That's where her shop is. But let's have a look at fear. Let's break it down. What am I afraid of when I'm doing parkour? I'm afraid of catching my feet in things. This is quite a common fear amongst older practitioners. Jumping over a box or over a rail, convinced you're going to catch your feet, fall forwards and splat into the floor. That's where visualization comes in. A lot of people talk about visualization as a means of visualizing landing. Unfortunately, for many people, you visualize what could go wrong. And that's an example of that is loss of balance. If I'm standing and I have to let go of the lamppost that I'm holding, I'm afraid of losing my balance and I visualize falling off and hurting myself. I'm also afraid of disappointing myself and coaches, people I'm working with, by not being able to do something, which is why this point of setting the training at the top end of the challenge section, the stretch section, is really important, because if you start there and you're not able to do it, then it's disappointing. And of course, I'm afraid of major injury. What do I mean by major injury? Well, I'm not that concerned about the pain. I don't, shinjuries and bruising and cuts and bleeding, not a problem. But major injury is an issue. And what I mean by major injury is something that prevents you from training, so you don't get to do parkour. It's a huge inconvenience for family, and it can impact your work. So I have to meet client deadlines. I work as an independent, and often stuff is time sensitive. If I am put out of action by an injury, then I will lose clients. And it's also the case that if you're older, it takes longer to recover. Now, there's a wonderful Japanese management technique which is called 5 whys, which if somebody asks something, you say, why? And then they explain and you say, why? And if they can get through this 5 times with having a concrete, sensible answer, then they've actually got a valid point. People like Toyota use this to decide what they're going to add to vehicles. But here we're going to use them to decompose fear. So I'm afraid of spinning backwards on a bar. I really am. But why am I afraid of it? I'm afraid of going too fast. Well, actually, that's not the problem. I'm afraid of losing my grip on the bar because I'm going too fast. And I'm not really afraid of losing my grip on the bar at all. I'm afraid of hitting my head on the floor and that resulting in permanent major injury, etc., etc., etc. Now, yes, there's only 4 whys here, but you could break the other one down as why is major permanent injury a problem? It's because it disrupts life, it impacts family and work, and you can't do parkour. Let's have another look. 5 whys again. I'm afraid of standing on a high bar. It's because I'm afraid of losing my balance and falling off. And actually, I'm not really afraid of that. I'm afraid of not being able to recover and land safely. And again, afraid of hitting the ground and afraid, therefore, of major permanent injury. This is a very useful technique. So if you want, please pause the video, think about what scares you in parkour and why, and you can use this to decompose that fear into something that is more manageable. Now, Hedge, also known as John Hall, of Access Parkour and Parkour Earth, has this scale that he uses, so I'm stealing his scale here, where we're going to assess fear from 0, which it's not noticeable, to 5, where you're aware that there's a risk, but it's not that bad. 7, which is a conscious effort required to overcome that fear. And then, of course, 10, when you're paralyzed with abject terror and you can't possibly move. So this is a useful scale. So if you look at something and you think, is this a 5? Is this a 7? Is it above 7? And it's important that while we can all agree in the scale, we perceive it differently. And that difference in perception is important because it will allow people to manage their fear differently. So let's have a look at what happens with people. So here's a donut version of the same scale. Let's say a beginner sits on one side, an intermediate has less fear and is able to do more scary things, and then an expert is even less fear implied and they can do much bigger, scarier things. So that we can maybe map things together so that it doesn't quite work with the picture, but let's say beginner 7 is an expert 2. And it's important for people to bear this in mind. And they're also important to bear in mind that what training does is it moves your fear profile upwards so that you're less scared. On the other hand, if you're injured, it moves you back down again. So if you have a break from training as well, that's not going to help. And you lose your ability. So The scale is relative. And Kirsten Altenbach came up with a very important concept as well when she was reviewing these slides, which is that learning really only happens when you're in the 5 to 7 zone. Things happening to the lower level are too easy for you to learn, the things that you can do very straightforwardly, and then too scary above 7. Your brain is occupied in dealing with fear and hasn't got the capacity to learn. So ideally, you need to find the student's fear level and optimize the exercises so that it falls between 5 and 7. This is really important because we can sum it up as saying that terror plus success is delight, which is what we want to do. Terror plus failure is disappointment. And as I keep saying, we want to avoid disappointment. Now, I mentioned there that the brain can't learn because it's dealing with fear. So here's a little exercise. You might, if you want to pause and think about this, how many things can you concentrate on at once? Can you manage the fear at the same time as looking at foot placement and figuring out where you're going to land, etc.? How many of these can you keep in your head at one time? Now, let's look at mitigating fear. So back to litmus, we have stretch and impossible, which is where the fear starts, and the challenge zone bridges these two areas. But there's a mental barrier between stretch and impossible that we need to find mitigations to address. So I wanted to talk through a few mitigations I've found and people I've trained with have found that help us overcome fear and achieve what we're physically able to but are too scared to do initially. One of them is shared risk, shared anxiety. So this is me at UGA this summer, jumping from a moderately high, fairly narrow, very sharp edge stone block down into a slightly wider one. It's quite a big distance for my size. It's near my limit. It's also got quite a lot of drop on it, and it's going over a set of steps, so it's not something that you can conveniently land on in the middle. But I knew I should be able to do it, but I was standing there and my brain was saying no. And I asked Lynn Pearson, who helped me refine this concept, stand, not to spot, but just stand there. And they're ready to spot, but she was really just standing there, sharing the anxiety and the risk, and boom, I was able to do it. This works incredibly well, just having somebody stand there watching what you're doing, and you're kind of outsourcing some of the fear to them and outsourcing some of the management of the jump. And it's a really effective and very easy approach. Now here's Lynn. She was practicing landing on the concrete block that you can see at the left there. And this was part of an exercise set by Leah Cutcat. And the concept's 1,000 attempts. So if you can't land on the concrete block, so going from the bricks to there is quite a big jump by our standards. And it's a corner, it's surrounded by vegetation. Landing badly on that edge could damage your ankle. It's quite scary from that point of view. So the solution of 1,000 attempts is you just keep working on jumping around it. You don't try and hit the actual target, but you hit round it until you get so used to it that you realize that actually you can absolutely land on it. And it's very effective. Obviously, you don't need to do 1,000, but it's the repetition makes the fear significantly less important. It mitigates the fear. You can then focus on landing rather than worrying about the distance or the surrounds. It's an important technique. Another one that I call optical adjustment works very, very well for me. So for example, this is me in room to move, doing a lashie up onto that box. Now, initially that box probably was slightly further away, and my brain was saying no on that, so I move it very slightly back, just talking about a couple of centimeters, an inch, couple of inches, and I can do that. Then I can slowly move the box further and further away, having mastered the move, and it's removed that initial fear so that I can achieve it. So I know it's achievable, and then I can systematically extend my reach. Very effective in a gym, not so easy to do outside where things are fixed, obviously. Similarly, in a gym, intentional use of a mat can be incredibly effective to overcome certain fears. It's not about using mats all the time so that every surface is soft, because outside they're not. It's about overcoming particular fears. In this case, this is me spinning off the bar backwards, which, as I've said earlier, is one of my fears. I'm trying to learn how to do that, but I am terrified of hitting my head, even though there's plenty of space. I'm terrified of falling off. So I was using the mat here to soften the landing so that I knew that if I did slip, I wouldn't hurt myself. And that was important. And similarly, not all jumps feel the same. If you're doing a long jump at a low level, that doesn't mean to say that you will automatically be able to do a long jump of the same distance at height, because the height adds fear. So mitigating practices for this are to repeatedly jump at ground level, the same distance, until you establish that yes, you really can land on the target, or finding a shorter jump at the same height so that you overcome the height fear. Or indeed we can put a spotter in there, or as I said, shared risk and anxiety, having your training buddy just standing there sharing that risk. So remember that height and distance interact, and just because you can do a particular distance at the ground doesn't mean to say you'll be able to do it at a higher level. Another very interesting observation that came when I was training with one of my training buddies here, Graham Grant, was that while very good practitioners, like professionals, they can do great big long run-ups and transition into a jump. For us, that doesn't work. As beginners, intermediates, we have a tendency to start with a run, follow through the run, and then just as we come to do the jump, let's say we're doing a cat leap here, stop, change our body position, and then do the jump, so that we lose all the momentum, so there was no point in doing that run-up. Now, Adam Romain of Access recommends that we use 3 or 5 steps in every activity, and it really makes a difference, because you can plan left, right, jump, except that was 4, and when you're managing it much more easily than trying to do very long runs. And this was incredibly helpful, and sometimes not having a run at all actually makes it easier. So if somebody is struggling with that transition, if they're doing stutter steps, you know, those little steps that change your feet, change the distance because you're not quite right, start closer. Don't try and do a huge run up. Really important observation. That transition also comes in to multi-skill training sessions. I really like multi-skill, where you do, say, half an hour of one skill, half an hour of another, half an hour of another one, to do a 90-minute long session. It's really very interesting to do multiple skills. However, as you transition from one skill to another, you have to re-warm up mentally, if not physically. So, for example, moving from climbing a tree through to climbing a wall, it's at height, but it's a different set of moves. It's different physically. And then you might move from climbing that wall into jumping or vaulting. And if you're going into jumps, you need to get your jumping legs. If you're going into vaults, you need to get your vaulting mind, arms and back set up. And this transition is very important. And again, thanks to Lynn for working on this concept with me. It's very important when you're planning a transition. Now, if between skills, if you are doing this day in, day out all the time, then it's not an issue. But if you're only doing it every few days or once a week, this really matters, because it's a mental change, and your legs have different activities. It's also interesting transitioning between running and jumping. I don't mean like in the previous slide, but if you're a runner, transitioning from doing a running section into a jumping section, again, you have to change your mind, even if your legs are hot. Now, all of these skills are really important, and you'd think that they'd stay with you, but they don't. Both the skill and the confidence to do the exercise have half-lives. Half-life being the term used with radioactivity, so it's the length of time it takes for the radioactive thing to become half as radioactive as it was at the beginning. Now, moves that you haven't practiced for a long time have a half-life, so you will be able to break it today, but next week, week after, you may not be able to break it because you haven't done it for a while, so that your confidence half-life has hit. So you should be able to do it, but it just doesn't work. It's a little bit like the thing I mentioned earlier. The good news, however, is that coming back up to that skill level is very quick. It's not like you have to go through the whole process again. So pause if you want. What problems do you find in fear in the practice in particular? What mitigation techniques are going to work for you to overcome those problems? They're not all fear, they may be access or shape or size. What mitigation techniques work? And how do you help other people break their jumps? How can you collaborate with other people and make sure that they're able to progress into their stretch zone and potentially up into the beginning of their I thought this was impossible section? So, finally, I'm going to talk about function. This is me presenting on stage with a quite large audience at an event a few years ago. Yes, I am waving a sink plunger around because I was explaining to an audience of IT people that they are plumbers and that their principal function is making sure that all the plumbing works, hence the sink plunger. I think one of the things that has best captured the concept of parkour for me is the Yamak message of être fort, être utile, to be strong, to be useful. And I think to be strong and to be useful is how we link what we're doing in our training to everyday life and how we can improve our lives and the people around us. And for me, that's super important. But there's another aspect of it, which is sustained mobility. And I kind of capture this as this older man here who has a walking frame. And this is actually a photograph showing difficulties that people will face in urban mobility. But I want to be able to vault over that, even if it's very, very slowly and stiffly and with a level of discomfort. When I'm at his age, I don't want to be using a walker. I want to be using my legs and my arms to be able to move properly. And that's a very important objective. So understanding people's objectives is important in this activity. And how can we do that? Well, one of the mechanisms that I found tremendously useful in all sorts of areas is called the conscious competence learning model. So we have 4 boxes forming a matrix of unconscious and consciousness, incompetency and competency, and lining these up and knowing which box you fit in is really important. Incompetent and unconscious is very dangerous. It's unformed and at risk. People don't know why they can't do something, which means that they will typically try and do it and they are at risk of hurting themselves. If we move into conscious incompetence, then we are in a position that we're ready to learn. We recognize that we're not very good at something and we can identify our weaknesses and then address them. Now, a lot of people fall into the unconscious competent box in parkour who are natural practitioners. So they can do jumps, they can climb, they can swing, they can do all these amazing moves and big jumps. But they don't necessarily understand how they do it or what it is that they are doing to achieve that, which means that it's difficult to coach somebody, because if it comes really naturally to you, then breaking it down is something that you need to learn how to do. And learning how to do that puts you into this conscious competent position, which is the ideal position. It's are you both able and aware? Now, again, pause. Honest assessment of yourself. Where are you on this chart? How did you get there? And what's your goal and how are you going to reach it? Hopefully everybody wants to be conscious competent and looks at the journey. But it's a very useful method, again, for assessing not just yourself, but other people and knowing where you are. Now, yes, my day job is being an analyst. And one of the things that I like doing as an analyst is finding dimensions to measure things. So looking at parkour in various versions of this presentation, I came up with 8 eventually with the help of Lynn and Kirsten. We had 8 dimensions for any particular activity, and I think this is a very useful mechanism. It's called a spider chart. There's some translations down at the bottom. If you're not familiar with it, it's fairly obvious how to use it. So let's take weightlifting, for example. It's something that has a focus on mobility, but principally strength and stamina. It takes a bit of courage to pick up a big bar, and there's a few rules about it, but it doesn't require reactivity, which I mean is assessing the situation and figuring out what to do. It doesn't require a degree of coolness about it. There's no play in it, and the courage is fairly limited because it's a fixed set of options that you can go for. Yoga has a big focus on mobility. It has a bit of regulation around it. It's a standard set of moves that you do. It doesn't involve any particular reactivity. It's not particularly cool in that sense. It does have a degree of playfulness, and some of the more complicated moves definitely require courage, stamina, and strength, but it's not the focus. Gymnastics is heavily regulated. Some of the moves are cool, but that's not the point. It's not at all playful. If you try and play about, you get told off because it's not within the rules. Some of the moves do take a good deal of courage and stamina and mobility, but it's an unbalanced activity if you look at it on these dimensions. Now, parkour has no regulation on it. It should be cool. You have to react to circumstances very quickly, so it's got high reactivity. It's got a strong aspect of mobility. Strength isn't as important as many people think it is. Stamina, on the other hand, is. Courage and playfulness are essential to make the most of it. Now, this is labeled as reach because you can start out. A beginner's parkour map is quite different. So it's going to have much less in the mobility, much less strength. Reactivity, you may not know how to respond to things. It should still be cool, should still require playfulness and courage. This map applies to other things, and it's really interesting to go back to être fort, être utile, because we might look at something like DIY, fixing things in your house. Often it requires mobility, strength, and stamina. It is regulated. It should be cool fixing things, and very often you have to figure out how to do things on your own that you may not be familiar with. Study and exams, if you're a student, then there's a lot of regulation in there. You have to be able to react to things. It's cool to do well. It's important. It takes a lot of stamina to work through it, and sometimes it takes courage to face what might be a very complicated exam process, and playfulness does have a little place in there, but it's not a main focus. Now, one of the things I do in a day job, as you've seen that picture there with a sink plunger, is presenting at large events. And this requires a degree of reactivity because you may have a fixed presentation, but you have to change your pace and respond to the audience and change the topics according to what people are finding interesting when you're talking. Doesn't require a lot of mobility, strength. It takes quite a lot of stamina because if you're speaking constantly for an hour, it's a lot of hard work. Playfulness really encourages a fun event and being cool about it. Also encourages people's engagement. If you don't have those factors, you end up with a really dull presentation, and I'm sure everybody has seen dull presentations. Now, this is something that I get to do. So here's a picture of me at an event in Glasgow recently. I have to say that Scotchy stuff makes great stage wear. Those are ninjas on there. Now, the other thing that I do for a living is being an expert witness in court cases, where being in court, cross-examined by a hostile attorney, is very demanding. It takes a lot of courage. There's a lot of rules about what you can and can't do. It takes a lot of stamina. Physical strength and mobility are not rated because you're sitting down most of the time. You have to control yourself, so coolness is kind of important. You have to be able to react and respond on your feet. So it's something that I enjoy doing, but it's not appropriate for wearing scotches. You have to try and remember how to tie a tie, which, as you can see, I'm not very good at. Being a parkour coach is much more regulated than just being a practitioner, but it hits lots and lots of buttons. Playfulness is really important to make a fun session for people engagement, and mobility, you have to be able to demonstrate stuff yourself. So be interesting to see, where do you put yourself on this? So maybe pause the video, think about it, think, does this model work for you? Is it important? Would you use it to assess something you do in your daily life? And very importantly, really, can we use this to match training activities to people? So can we map a person on where they are in their journey on each of these axes, and then map it against a particular move to see whether it's appropriate for them? So finally, I've got a summary here. I like this scale very much for tracking where somebody is on the scale and what they want to achieve. The impossible section being broken into two parts is really interesting because the goal has to be in stretch in the beginning of impossible, and we all move over. But I'm going to say it yet again, it's really important to set the training so that it ends at the top of stretch and doesn't start there, because that's totally frustrating because you can't do it at that point. You need to work up to it. Recognize different fear levels. Try and keep your training within 5 to 7 on fear. Accept that different people, beginners, intermediates, and experts, have different levels. So maximize learning by focusing intently on fitting into 5 to 7. Then work on mitigations for overcoming fear. You've got to be able to break down those barriers. You've got to find techniques. Not all techniques work for all people. And it's very interesting to explore how to do this. It isn't just a case of telling people how to do it or expecting them to do it. Find new mechanisms that mitigate that fear. It's really fascinating. Use the conscious competent model to move yourself into the right place. Be aware of unconscious incompetents who are likely to hurt themselves, and accept that some movements will fall outside of your target, so that you may be a unconscious competent in certain areas, and learn to break it down so that you become a conscious competent. I think that's a really important mechanism. And let's have a look at the activity dimensions for whatever you're doing, whether it's parkour or other activities in your life or other sporting activities. We could map dance onto this. We can map aerials onto it, for example. It's very interesting. So, final pause. Can we put all of this into practical use? Does it apply in your practice? And then, can we use these techniques to grow diversity, to bring people who aren't the standard practitioners into the activity? Can we use this to understand where the limits fall and make sure that we can bring the actions within those limits to make it more accessible? And finally, important advice, always eat the ice cream. Parkour is a lot of work. You deserve a nice ice cream at the end, and enjoy it.